Tracy, thank you. And President Donald Trump's COVID-19 diagnosis has many of you asking about invoking the 25th Amendment. What does that look like and who enforces it? For that, we turn to Liza Lucas at the 11 Alive Bridge, breaking down the amendment and what many of you are saying online about it.
That's right. We want to break it down because there was a huge spike in Google searches for the 25th Amendment when news of the president's positive COVID test broke. So the basics of the 25th Amendment, well, it's pretty clear for most people. When a president passes away, resigns, or is removed from office, well, the VP takes over. But what if the president is still in office and unable to serve? Well, experts say this can go down a couple of ways. One way, the president submits a written declaration to the president pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House of Representatives. In this case, that'd be Chuck Grassley and Nancy Pelosi. The vice president, Mike Pence, would then act as president until President Trump submits a written declaration that he can resume. The second way it could go down, the VP and a majority of the, quote, principal officers of the executive departments, which is generally thought to be the president's cabinet, submit a written declaration to the president pro tem of the Senate and the House Speaker that the president is unable to serve. And, well, the president would be allowed to contest that, and that would probably prompt a vote from Congress. So experts say that there's really no precedent in terms of that option number 2, but still a lot of people wondering how this would all potentially unfold. So there you have it right there. Comments coming in across social media. Brenda saying he's doing his job even from the hospital, and Flora also talking about precautions that have already been put in place as they were when President Reagan was in office. So a lot of people looking to the past to see how this could unfold in the present. We're going to stay on top of it here at the 11 Alive Bridge and keep you posted, but weigh in. Use that hashtag MorningRushATL.